Welcome to topic 1 in our first chapter on biodiversity. I want to talk about how biodiversity is created and whether it's good or not, and what are some threats. So in this picture, which do you think's better, this or this? Well, obviously, multiculturalism, understanding different races of people, different ethnic backgrounds, we learn more from each other, and it's a better thing than this one type of person. Same with this. This is just a whole field full of corn, and this is a tropical rainforest with a variety of plants. The variety of plants, or picture B, is much better. Same idea here. So what do you think biodiversity means? Well, what does bio mean? Bio means life. And what does diversity mean? Diversity means variety. So a variety of life. Biodiversity is the variety of life, and it's essential to us depending on each other. Scientists have known more than 2 million species, and there's tens of millions that are unknown. So there's tremendous variety on the earth. So there's 3 ways that biodiversity is created. One which we'll look at later on, topic 4, and that's diversity within our genetic makeup. For example, dogs have genes that are different within their groups. Diversity within species, for example, monkeys, dragonflies, and diversity within ecosystems. So let's look at how an ecosystem is organized from smallest to increasing in diversity. If we looked at an ecosystem and just studied a species, that would be a group of organisms that have same structure and can reproduce together. But if we went bigger and studied a population would be a group of individuals with the same species living in an area. A school of fish, a flock of birds would be a whole population. And if we looked at a community would be basically all the living things in a certain area. So studying in our playground, for example, if we studied the community, that'd be all the living things in the playground. The plants, the animals, and so on. If we studied something even more diverse and bigger, that would be the ecosystem, then we would take the community and see how it interacts with non-living. So an ecosystem is living things and how they interact with non-living in a shared environment or area. Let's look at how living things and biodiversity work around the world. This is approximately the equator, if I can draw a straight line. And there's a trend or a pattern that exists when it comes to diversity within this zone of the equator, which is the tropical area. As you move away from the equator, biodiversity decreases less and less. So for example, if you take snakes, there's 293 different species of snakes in Mexico. There's only 126 snakes in the United States, and there's only 22 snakes in Canada. So as you go up away from the equator, diversity decreases. And this has a lot to do with something called habitat and niche. There are 2 kinds of organisms. One are specialists, which can hone in on a particular niche, which is what it eats, where it lives, how it's affected by the environment. Specialists versus generalists. Okay? So back to the world again. Organisms that are specialists are able to live along the equator, and the habitat here and the niche doesn't vary as much. For example, I used to live in Singapore, and the temperature range in Singapore was between 25 and 30 year round. So a snake that lives in Singapore can be a specialist. It doesn't have to, it lives in a very narrow niche. So this is a narrow zone along the tropics. However, an organism that's a snake that lives up here in Canada, it has a very broad niche that it lives in because temperature ranges are huge, as well as other living conditions within its environment. And so it has to be what's called a generalist. Generalists live in broad niches. Generalists are in broad niches. Specialists live in narrow niches. And in general, narrow niches are along the tropics, which is where specialists live, and broad niches are further down away from the tropics. And that's where you'll find generalists. One thing we should be aware of when it comes to living things is how they get along. In general, symbiosis is a relationship between two species. Now that relationship might be sour or bad, or it could be good or indifferent. One type of symbiosis is commensalism. That's a relationship where two species, one benefits and the other is not harmed. Barnacles, for example, attach to the whale, and they benefit by getting food as the whale swims, but the whale could care less. It's not harmed or anything. Another kind of symbiosis is mutualism. Mutualism is two species in which both species benefit. For example, a honeybee and a flower. Okay. The flower gets pollinated by the bee and the bee gets food. A third kind of symbiosis is parasitism. For example, a tapeworm living inside a human. The tapeworm gets the food that the human eats, and the human gets sick along the way and is harmed. Parasitism. So what makes an organism well adapted for its niche has to do with something called natural selection. An organism has certain structures and behaviors that allow it to fit or be well suited for the environment or not. And if it's not well suited for the environment, it might die out. So adaptations enable an organism to survive, pass on those traits to their other organisms, and therefore keep going in an ecosystem. Let's talk about the case of the peppered moth as a good example. In England in 1950, light speckled pepper moth were most common, and the dark one wasn't very common at all. However, when the Industrial Revolution hit, pollution killed the light-colored lichen on the trees, and soot and pollution darkened the tree trunks. Now, the light speckled moths really stood out, and the dark ones were camouflaged. And so what happened was birds could now see the light moths better, and over time, natural selection by bird predation favored the dark moths, and the amount of dark moths started to go up, and the amount of speckled moths, like this one, stood out, and their population went way down due to adaptations. Then in the 1950s, the clean air laws came into effect, and the lichens grew back on the trees. Birds ate more of the dark moths now because they stood out, and the white moths were camouflaged. And so that's a good example of how a structural adaptation might change what is happening within an ecosystem for diversity. We could also have behavioral adaptations that change an organism's diversity. There are lots of threats to biodiversity. As you know, it's desirable. Okay, organisms could be extinct, or worse yet, extirpated. Not worse yet. This is worse. Extirpated means they've only been wiped out in a certain ecosystem, but not the whole world. For example, bison Bison were extirpated, but they weren't extinct, and we've regrown the bison population. Other things that affect logging, overhunting, too much agriculture creates less biodiversity, pollution, and human development. So there's a quick overview of topic 1.